Why isn't Puerto Rico a state? There have been Puerto Ricans pushing for statehood since the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico at the end of the 1800s.
United States territory since 1898.
In fact, the man who's considered the father of the statehood movement died 100 years ago. So what has taken so long? Why didn't the US make Puerto Rico a state back then when it fought a war and took it from Spain? In one word, racism. The US Supreme Court essentially said they're not like us. They decided that Puerto Rico and other territories now belong to the US, but would not be treated like states because the people who lived there were, quote, alien races. So you might not be surprised when I tell you that was the same court that approved segregation in the United States. Because, again, racism. But that horrible ruling that discriminated against Black Americans was eventually overturned. But what came to be known as the insular cases are still good law in the US, and Puerto Rico and other territories are still possessions that are treated differently than states. So the Puerto Ricans who still want statehood say it's time to change that.
Puerto Rico is a colony and would cease to be that once it became a state.
They believe it is overdue.
120 years later, it's about time.
And they say statehood is about democracy and equality.
It is crazy that we are governed by laws that we are not able to decide.
If you watch the two other videos in this series, you know not all Puerto Ricans want statehood. But this video is about those who do. After the US came to Puerto Rico and claimed it as theirs, some Puerto Ricans thought this meant they were going to be part of the Union. But those hopes came crashing down when the US put in place a colonial government. The US allowed Puerto Rico to have one person represent them in Congress, but that person could not vote. And that's still the way it is today. But let me take you 50 years after the US took possession of Puerto Rico. They were still not inclined to make Puerto Rico a state.
But at this stage, neither independence nor statehood will meet the realities of Puerto Rico's economic position.
So in the previous video, I talk about how along with the governor, they pushed for what we have today, what we call the commonwealth. But more and more Puerto Ricans are agreeing that's just a fancy way of saying colony. But it's important to note that at the time, a majority of Puerto Ricans supported that Commonwealth status, and the party that represented that option held the governor's seat for a couple of decades. But during that time, the statehood party was right there waiting their turn. And in the late 60s, they won the governor's seat. What they didn't get was a yes vote on statehood. At the time, 60% of Puerto Ricans voted for the Commonwealth status. But once they were in power, the statehood party worked to change the conversation. And for that, we have to talk about Carlos Romero Barceló. Romero Barceló became governor in the 70s, and he was responsible for changing the conversation about statehood in three ways. First, he insisted statehood was about equality.
He learned a lot of important lessons throughout his lifetime. Some of them he passed on to me, and I tried to honor him in those lessons. But the most important one that I learned, it's not about being a number, a star in the flag, or a number in a list of states. It's about being equals. And as the Constitution, we are all created equal, and that's what we fight for.
The second one was more controversial because Romero Barceló said statehood is for the poor. He said Puerto Rico should aspire to statehood because it would get the same welfare benefits as the rest of the states. And the reason this was controversial is because Puerto Rico was already heavily dependent on the US at the time.
Today, fully 2/3 of the Puerto Rican populace receive food stamps.
So to some, it sounded like moving in the wrong direction.
When we say that the statehood is for the poor in Puerto Rico, is because they're going to have better services. You have better health services, you have better social services, you have more access to all the benefits that involve being a United States citizen.
And lastly, Romero believed Puerto Ricans are entitled to statehood. Not that it's a privilege, but that it is a right.
Iremos al Congreso no a suplicar de rodillas, sino de pie a exigir lo que por derecho como ciudadanos americanos nos corresponde.
More than 40 years after that speech and up until the end of his life, Romero stood by that message.
No lo estamos pidiendo, lo vamos a exigir y no lo pueden negar porque somos ciudadanos americanos.
So the question is, what has changed in those 40 years that Puerto Ricans can now demand statehood and get it?
For the first time in history, we had exactly the same vote as the 37 admitted states. Statehood, yes or no. And we got a majority of the vote.
Puerto Ricans have been asked the question of status 5 times before, with mixed results and a lot of controversy. Because usually the way it goes is that the party in power will call for a vote, but the opposing party will disagree with the way the question is being framed. So in 2012 and 2017, the statehood option won, but the opposing party had called for a boycott, so they said that doesn't count. The statehood party still went to Congress with the results and asked for statehood, but didn't succeed. So in 2020, they tried again, and they asked Puerto Ricans if they wanted statehood, and 52% said yes. But the controversy of previous votes was still there. The arguments against this one are that the majority was too slim for such a monumental decision, that the turnout was low compared to other elections, and that other options were not included.
Always notice that the people that nitpick are those that oppose statehood and that won't accept statehood under any circumstance. So they're not doing it because they want to be electoral Puritans. They're doing it because they're trying to find anything to grab onto to prevent Puerto Rico becoming a state.
And then there's Jose Bernardo Marquez. He's a Puerto Rican legislator who wants statehood for Puerto Rico, but he says all parties should be included in the process.
While we are going to a U.S. government divided, it's the perfect excuse to keep ignoring the issue or saying that it's on us, the inability to find a solution.
There are 2 bills in Congress right now to deal with Puerto Rico's status. One of them seeks to make Puerto Rico a state based on the results of the last election. The other one calls for a status convention, where delegates who are elected by Puerto Ricans come up with status options, the US agrees to those options, and then Puerto Ricans vote on them.
When I say I favor a status convention, my support of statehood is questioned. What I'm saying is, well, I'm really looking for a statehood. I'm not looking for a statehood in a symbolic way in order to gain votes every 4 years.
That last thing he said is directed at the pro-statehood party, and it is a common criticism they face, that they use the issue of statehood to get Puerto Ricans to vote for them. And it is true that every 4 years Puerto Ricans hear the promise of statehood, and that this is the term when it will finally happen. It has even become a joke among some Puerto Ricans.
Si nos ponemos unas metas que son inalcanzables, entramos fallidas del principio.
And to further complicate things, one of the people who got elected this year to advocate for statehood in Congress was Ricardo Rosselló, the governor that Puerto Ricans ousted after a summer of protests. He's one of 6 delegates trying to get support for the statehood bill. Melinda Romero is another one of the delegates, and both their fathers, Rossellós and Romeros, also went to Congress to ask for statehood years ago.
Si no quieren darme la cita, pues los espero en el parque. Así que de alguna manera vamos a llegarle a los representantes del Congreso.
So did Kenneth McClintock.
Yeah, it took New Mexico 65 years between their first request for statehood and actually being admitted. There was not political will for that, but you have to persevere.
In some ways, New Mexico was like Puerto Rico in that for a long time it was seen as foreign, with too many Spanish speakers to become a state. But some statehood supporters believe the racism and colonialism that has led to Puerto Rico being treated differently is on its way out.
I denounce and I criticize all of the aspects of that project, a political project, that are unjust, as colonialism is. I just think that the best way to fight that is participating.
And just like her father, Melinda believes the U.S. owes it to Puerto Ricans.
Our young men and women have spilled all their blood defending the democracy that exists in the United States, and we are a very pro-democratic region, and I think that is one of the most important things that we have. The day that the United States ceases to be a democratic nation and a free nation, well, then maybe you will have more people decided to separate instead of get included. But all the territories were abused at one point or another. And that doesn't mean that the nation in itself it's a bad thing to do.
So will it finally happen this time? Melinda says yes.
First of all, I trust myself. I know what I want, and I usually get what I want. And this is definitely a major change where we are here. We have an elected delegation. The people of Puerto Rico have clearly stated this is what we want. And I feel very confident that we'll be able to pass 5022 and eventually become the 51st or the 52nd state of the Union.
What do you think? Do you support statehood for Puerto Rico? And do you think it will happen before this term is over? If you want to learn more about the other options of independence, commonwealth, and free association, check out my previous 2 videos. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your patience. The reason it took me a little longer to post this 3rd video in this series is because I ran out of money. You might remember I did a fundraiser for the land investigation, so we're all set for that. I've been able to hire amazing local talent to do those videos, and I cannot wait to share the first video of that series with you. But I want to cover more topics. And every other video I've been able to do on this channel in the last year has been because I have a Patreon and I have amazing supporters on there, and their donations help cover the cost of these videos. But you might have noticed that I started hiring people to do fact-checking, video editing, graphics, and that can get costly. So I had to pause until I had enough money to get this video done. I have so many more ideas for videos, and I want to bring you high-quality content more often. The good news is that now there's a way for you to support me right here on YouTube. It's called memberships, and for a monthly fee, you get exclusive perks, and you'll be supporting my videos. You can join by clicking the button below the video or by going to the link I'm going to put in the comments. As always, thank you, and I'll see you soon.